Welcome to a Sober Shepherds podcast. My name is David Weitz. They told me recovery was about putting the drink and drug down. They told me it was about meetings, steps, service, sponsorship, and God. But nobody told me about this part, the startle, that sudden jolt that hits you out of nowhere like a trap door opening up underneath your feet. That flash of fear that makes your whole chest cave in before your brain can even interpret what the hell just happened. And no matter how much time I acquire, that startle still lives in me. And I know that I'm not alone, because no matter what room you choose to recover in, every one of us knows that moment. It's that moment where something small happens, a delayed text, a change of tone, someone goes quiet, someone leaves early, someone forgets to call you back, and suddenly you're 8 years old again, standing in a house where love meant unpredictability, where safety was a rumor, where abandonment was the natural predator that stalked you everywhere you went. That's the part nobody prepares you for in early recovery. Not the steps, not the slogans, not the coffee and all the inspirational bullshit. Not even the meetings themselves where everybody nods like they're fine. Because this part isn't about drugs or alcohol. It's about trauma. It's about the wiring. It's about what happens to a child who grows up in a house that taught them to fear their own needs. And here's the truth that took me the past 40 years to figure out. A startle isn't a sign that something's wrong today. It's a memory your body still hasn't filed away from yesterday. You're sober. You're sane. You're present. You're doing the work. But that wounded part of you is still living in your ribcage waiting for danger, waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for the abandonment you learned to brace before you even knew the alphabet. That's what happens to me at least twice a week. A simple moment, no drama, no conflict, no threat. And suddenly I feel like a burden. I feel like I was too much, like I was bothering someone, like I should just pull back and disappear. That's the old script. That's the old ghost. That's not reality. That's recovery trauma speaking in its mother tongue. And you know what's wild? Minutes later, the truth showed up in a message. Affection, warmth, connection. Proof that my mind lied to me again, and God sent comfort to correct it. But that gap, that space between fear and reality, that's where the real work happens. That's the recovery no one talks about. And that's why I'm sitting in front of this microphone today. Because I'm tired of the shallow lectures. I'm tired of the influencers with millions of followers saying, well, if somebody treats you badly, you shouldn't hang out with them. Yeah, no shit. I didn't survive decades of addiction, institutions, homelessness, psych wards, relapses, church, 2 12-step fellowships, and trauma work to give you a fortune cookie. I'm here to talk about the things that actually keep us sick, the things that make us relapse, the things that make us isolate, the things that make us run, the things that make us sabotage healthy relationships because we don't know what safety really looks like. And if you've ever felt that startle, that sudden drop in your chest, that old panic that doesn't match the moment you're living in, I want you to know this. You're not broken. You're remembering. And remembering is a part of healing. You see, I didn't get sober in a straight line. I didn't walk into a meeting and magically get it. No. I crawled in pieces through every spiritual doorway recovery had to offer. People think you wander into a 12-step program, work the program, and suddenly your childhood evaporates. If only. But you know what the truth is? I relapsed more times than some people survived to get a second chance. I buried versions of myself that never came home. I woke up in institutions, detoxes, hospitals, psych wards, places where they overdosed me on meds instead of telling me the truth. Nobody talked about trauma in the 80s. Nobody said, hey kid, your nervous system is shattered because your childhood was a war zone. They just told me I was an alcoholic. As if that explained everything. As if addiction was the whole story. It wasn't. It was the symptom. But I didn't know that yet. So I wandered. 20 years in one program, 20 years in another. Almost 2 decades of speakers, slogans, steps, literature, anniversaries, and somehow my soul still had not thawed. I could talk recovery. I could quote recovery. I could perform recovery, but I couldn't feel safe. Then one day I walked into a meeting expecting something different. And guess what? The date changed again, but the addiction didn't. I still brought the same broken boy with me. I tried religion. I tried becoming the man I thought God wanted me to be. And I grew, but not in the places where the wounds lived. Then one day I was told, "You're not crazy, Dave. You're injured." That was the day a lifetime of confusion snapped into focus. Suddenly, all the pieces made sense. The abandonment wounds, the hypervigilance, the startles, the fear of being a burden, the shame that didn't belong to me. And after that, I studied the psychology of Dr. Abraham Lowe's work in Recovery Incorporated, the first man who ever explained the startle response that haunted me for decades. That involuntary surge of fear that happens before you can even think. He said temper is the mind's reaction. You're not responsible for the startle, only for training the reaction afterward. Do you know what that did to me? It freed me. It told me I wasn't effective. I was conditioned. And then years later, I found the one thing that glued everything together. God. A God I actually believed in. Not the God the rooms pressured me to invent. The God who actually met me where I was. Scared, imperfect, human, and ready to heal. By the time all these threads finally wove together, I had traveled through a lifetime of trauma I never volunteered for. And all of it, every relapse, every diagnosis, every institution, every room, every tear, every prayer, brought me here. Not to perfection, not to enlightenment, but to truth, to this mic, to this message, to this moment, to tell you, you can be sober for decades and still get startled. You can be a leader in recovery and still feel like a burden. You can be healed and still have wounds that whisper. And none of it means you're failing. It means you're human, because somewhere in recovery, long after the obsession to drink or drug is lifted, long after detox, long after the fog lifts, there's a moment nobody warned you about. A startle. It doesn't matter how long you've been sober. It doesn't matter how spiritual you think you are. It doesn't matter how many people you've helped, how many meetings you chair, how many sponsees you've walked through hell. The startle comes anyway. And this is the part old-timers don't talk about. Not because they're hiding it, but because nobody ever taught them the language for it. 12-step fellowships give us the tools for a daily reprieve to stop drinking and using drugs one day at a time. And that's it. Most people think the reactions come from the present moment, from whatever was said, whatever wasn't said, whatever text they didn't get back, whatever tone shifted they think they heard. But that's far from the truth. Your startle has nothing to do with the moment you're in. It's a memory wearing a disguise. The emotional startle is the body remembering something the mind has tried to bury. It's not the adult responding. It's the child reacting. And that child, the one who's learned to survive long before you learn to speak, still lives in the basement of your nervous system. So let's talk about that, because nobody ever does. That child grew up in a home where love had conditions, safety had rules, affection came with strings, anger arrived without warning, peace felt like walking on broken glass, silence was the loudest sound in the house, and approval was a currency you could never earn, only beg for. I learned early that the world was unpredictable. I learned the people who were supposed to protect me were also the ones I had to protect myself from. I learned that emotions were dangerous, needs were inconvenient, and boundaries were punishment waiting to happen. So that child developed a skill. Hypervigilance, a scanning system, a radar, a sensitivity to tone, body language, facial expressions, pauses in conversations, atmosphere shifts, things most people never pick up on. And here's the cruelest part. That system kept me alive, but it also never turned off. And that's where the startle is born. It's not a reaction. It's a survival reflex. A ghost from childhood tapping me on the shoulder saying, something's wrong. You're not safe. Watch out. And here's the thing that shocks people with decades clean and sober. You can have 10, 20, 30, 40 years sober and still have the emotional reflex of a scared 9-year-old. Because sobriety doesn't erase childhood. Meetings don't rewrite your nervous system. Step work doesn't reparent the child inside you who had to grow up too fast. Nobody told you that part. Nobody told you that the startle is wired into your autonomic nervous system, the subconscious involuntary part of you that still believes danger can appear out of nowhere because one day, long ago, it did. My startle isn't immaturity. It's not insecurity. It's not being dramatic. It's not overreacting. It's not being sensitive. It's not codependency or a character defect or a lack of faith. It's the oldest instinct trying to protect my youngest wound. The startle is my body saying, I've lived through abandonment before. I know what this feels like, and I'm not letting it happen again. So it overreacts. It catastrophizes. It jumps 10 steps ahead. It panics at tones, pauses, delays, imagined meanings, non-existent threats. Not because I'm weak, but because the child inside me learned to survive without anybody explaining the rules. And here's the truth nobody talks about. Most people never learn to separate the reflex from reality. They mistake the startle for intuition. They think it's a sign. They think it's God or fate or their gut. But it's not. It's the past interrupting the present. It's yesterday hijacking today. It's the oldest fear pretending to be the newest truth. And until someone explained this to me, until someone said it out loud, I went decades thinking, why am I like this? Why do I feel so broken? Why do I get scared over things other people brush off? Because nobody ever taught me what the startle really was. A trauma echo, a survival reflex, a child's alarm system ringing in an adult body. And I deserve to know that. Because there's a lie that floats around recovery circles. Nobody means harm by it, but it still poisons the well. Just go to meetings and everything will work itself out. No, it won't. If meetings alone healed childhood trauma, there wouldn't be people with 20, 30, 40 years sober still waking up with the same panic, the same startles, the same abandonment spikes, the same fear of being left behind, the same emotional reflex that was wired into them at age 7. So let me stitch myself into this because I've lived it. I sat in rooms for decades. I shared. I listened. I prayed. I made coffee. I set up chairs. I cleaned ashtrays back when people smoked in meetings. I did everything a good member was supposed to do, but nobody ever told me the truth. Meetings teach you sobriety. They don't teach you safety. And that startle inside me, that reflex that flares up over something as simple as someone being busy, that didn't originate from alcohol or drugs. It originated from my childhood. And meetings don't treat childhood trauma. Meetings don't teach you about the nervous system. Meetings don't explain hypervigilance. Meetings don't teach you about abandonment wounds that hijack your entire reality in 5 seconds flat. Meetings don't explain that your body can't tell the difference between being ignored at age 50 and being rejected at age 9. Nobody told me that. So I spent years thinking something was wrong with me. I thought I wasn't spiritual enough. I thought I wasn't grateful enough. I thought I wasn't working the program hard enough. I thought my feelings made me defective. I thought my trauma made me unfit for God's grace. I thought my startle meant I didn't trust God. Meanwhile, I was doing everything they suggested to do, and I still felt broken. And here's the truth nobody had the vocabulary for. You cannot 12-step your way out of childhood trauma. The rooms give you a foundation, and thank God for that. But they can't rebuild your nervous system. They can't rewire your triggers. They can't parent the child who still lives inside you. They can't give you an emotional language your family never taught you. They can't mentor you through things your sponsor doesn't understand. And I'll say something that might rattle a few cages, but it's my truth. Sponsors lead people, but a lot of them are the blind leading the blind. You have people with 1 year sober taking people through steps they barely understand themselves. They mean well, but they're terrified of being wrong. They rush through the steps trying to fix somebody they don't even know how to fix themselves. And 10, 15 years later, a divorce, a relapse, a nervous breakdown, a spiritual collapse, a trauma reaction they never even knew they were carrying. And they sit there saying, how the hell did this happen? I did everything right. No, you didn't. And I didn't either. We were never taught the emotional part. We were never taught the psychological part. We were never taught the trauma part. We were never taught the family systems part. We were never taught the inner child part. We were never taught the somatic part. We were never taught the neurobiological part. And why? Because the people teaching us weren't taught it either. So what do people do? They run to therapists. They run to psychiatrists. They get medicated into oblivion. They put Band-Aids on bullet wounds. And then they wonder why nothing changes. Well, the answer is quite simple. There's no prescription for fear of abandonment. So they medicate symptoms instead of curing causes. And that's why the Startled survives decades of sobriety. Because our programs don't claim to heal trauma. They only claim to help you stay sober a day at a time. And that's beautiful, but it's incomplete. Sobriety is step 1. Safety is step 2. Healing is step 3. Integration is step 4. Reparenting is step 5. Emotional fluency is step 6. Learning to separate the reflex from reality is step 7. And here's where I'm stitching myself directly into the heart of it. Today, decades into this process, a simple pause in communication triggered my abandonment. The reflex fired. The startle hit. The body screamed danger. And guess what? A message came later. Everything was fine. 0 threat, 0 abandonment, 0 rejection, 0 catastrophe. My body lied to me. My past lied to me. My childhood lied to me. And that's when it hit me. Again, meeting saved my life. But emotional education gave me a life worth living. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm talking into this microphone. Not as a guru, not as a therapist, not as a professor, not as a specialist, not as a man above anybody else, but as a survivor with a flashlight. A man who walked through hell so he could turn around and say, you're not crazy. You're not broken. You're not defective. You're not alone. You're traumatized, and it's treatable. You know, one of the greatest misunderstandings in recovery, and maybe one of the most dangerous, is the belief that sobriety equals safety. It doesn't. You collect decades of coins and raise your hand at every anniversary with 5, 15, 25, 47 years clean and sober and still be walking around with a nervous system that thinks the world is a war zone. I see it every day at the same meetings I've been attending since my daughter was a baby and witness these beautiful, loyal, committed men and women with decades of sobriety, and I don't see serenity. I see survival. I see bodies braced like they're waiting to be hit. I see eyes that never fully soften. I hear laughter that doesn't fully reach the heart. I listen to shares that are rehearsed and performed as if they were talking about trauma like it happened to someone else. And the saddest part? Most of them don't even know they're still unsafe because the program taught them how to stay sober, but nobody ever taught them to feel safe in their own skin. There are people with decades of sobriety who still flinch when someone raises their voice, who still shut down when someone doesn't text back, who still can't handle conflict, who still can't take a compliment, who still get flooded with shame when someone sets a boundary, who still can't sit still for more than 10 minutes without anxiety, who still think they have to perform to be loved. And they think this is normal. They think this is just how I am. They think the best thing they can hope for is a daily reprieve. No one ever told them sober doesn't automatically mean safe. Clean doesn't automatically mean calm. Dry doesn't automatically mean healed. Abstinent doesn't automatically mean emotionally mature. You could stop drinking, stop drugging, stop acting out, and still be ruled by the same childhood survival instincts that forced you into addiction in the first place. And let me stitch myself again directly into this. I stayed sober through things most people don't survive. Relapses, institutions, country hopping, homelessness, the whole odyssey. And yet on any given day, a simple pause in a friend's communication can yank the entire rug out of my emotional foundation and still feel unsafe. Not because anything was wrong, not because somebody abandoned me, not because the danger was real or there was any danger at all, but simply because my body remembered something my adult mind doesn't even consciously register anymore. The truth is ugly, but the grace of God is freeing once you face it. Sobriety doesn't cure the startle. Sobriety doesn't unwind your trauma. Sobriety doesn't teach you the difference between then and now. That's the part most sober people never learn. The startle doesn't come from the moment. It comes from the memory. By the time you've tried figuring it out, the body has already issued a full-scale evacuation order. This is why people panic over nothing. People assume the worst. People withdraw suddenly. People lash out. People misread silence. People create stories out of thin air. People relapse over things that weren't even happening. And most of them blame themselves. But it's not their fault. It's the wiring. It's the childhood imprint. It's the reflex of a scared child inside a sober adult. And that child wasn't taught safety. They were taught survival. They weren't taught to breathe. They were taught to brace. They weren't taught to trust. They were taught to predict danger. And sobriety doesn't magically overwrite that. If anything, sobriety reveals it. Because once the substance is gone, the truth emerges. You're sober, but the child inside you is still terrified. You're clean, but the nervous system still fires. You're recovered, but the startle still hits. And that's okay. It's not a failure. It's not a defect. It's not a spiritual weakness. It's an old wound asking to be named. And naming is not just healing. It's liberation. And then comes the moment nobody warns you about. The moment where all the running stops. But not because you got tired. It stops because you finally realize you're not being chased. For most of my life, I thought God was behind me with a clipboard grading me, correcting me, frowning at me. I thought life was this long hallway where every door I opened led to another version of not enough. So I kept moving, kept performing, kept trying to outrun shame, guilt, fear, memory, and expectation. But recovery did something strange. It didn't give me new legs. It took away the hallway. It opened up space, stillness, a room large enough for my soul to breathe without apologizing. And in that room, I realized something that flipped my entire map. God wasn't behind me with a clipboard. He was in front of me with an outstretched hand. Not demanding, not correcting, not commanding, just waiting, quietly, patiently, like somebody who already knew I'd eventually get tired of running in circles. And that's when sobriety shifts from maintenance to meaning, because it stops being about avoiding the drink, avoiding the drug, avoiding the old life, avoiding the old version of yourself. And it becomes about stepping into the life that was trying to reach you long before you ever wanted it. It becomes about participation instead of punishment, direction instead of desperation, calling instead of chasing. This is the part newcomers never believe when I tell them your sobriety isn't a sentence. It's an invitation. An invitation to stop living like someone who's constantly being dragged. An invitation to stop seeing God as a puppeteer or a warden or a judge. An invitation to discover the version of yourself that addiction buried but never erased. And the craziest part? You realize you were never actually lost. You just never stopped long enough to let yourself be found. And if you've made it this far with me, then maybe, just maybe, you were meant to hear this today. Because there comes a moment in recovery when you stop trying to impress God and you just let Him in. Not the God you were taught to fear. Not the God who was weaponized with guilt and shame. Not the God inherited with broken adults who couldn't even love themselves. I'm talking about the God who remained when everything else fell apart. The God who watched you break and didn't walk away. The God who saw the child in you long before you remember He existed. The God who stayed in the room when you were too embarrassed, too addicted, too wounded, too tired, too sick or too hopeless to pray. I've come to learn something I never expected. God doesn't need your understanding. He just needs your consent. Understanding comes later. Clarity comes later. Faith comes in pieces. Hope grows in secret. And grace? Grace shows up like a quiet guest slipping in through the back door when the house is a wreck. And somehow still calling it a home. If you're listening to this, I want you to hear me. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not defective. You are not spiritually stupid. You're just early in the rebuilding. You're laying bricks where you used to stack straw. You're learning a language with no alphabet. You're rebuilding a relationship with a God who is patient enough to wait for you and loving enough to meet you where you fell. You don't have to understand God today. You don't have to pretend you believe like the person next to you. You don't have to borrow somebody else's faith. You just have to stay. Stay one more day. Stay one more meeting. Stay one more moment in the truth. Stay long enough for the miracle to reach you. Because it will. It always does. Not when you perform, but when you surrender. Because in the end, recovery is the presence of truth. And the beautiful part is, once the truth shows up, the lies don't stand a chance. We heal by remembering who we are, not who fear tells us to be. So if you're listening today, stay honest, stay willing, stay right here. Because if you do, one day you won't just believe in miracles. You'll realize you've become one.